Welcome to Fichuk Enterprises YouTube channel, where I have forgot to record and noticed after the first question, like happened in a previous interview that I did. Quite often, actually, more often than I would like. I'm working on it, I promise you. Anyways, we're here today talking domestic violence with Molly.
Hello.
Welcome, heroes and villains, to Fichuk Enterprises YouTube channel. Take a moment, relax, stop your bickering, and just enjoy the show. As I stated in the intro, this is a very touchy subject, and first and foremost, I want to thank you for talking about it. I know domestic violence happens more to women than men. Does it go on more than I realize, though?
I would think so. Did you know that it's almost half the population of Canada that experiences violence? If you didn't, then it happens more than you'd think. It's about 44% of women have experienced violence from their partner at some point in their life, and 36% of men. That's not to say that people are not re victimized multiple times by multiple partners. So, 80% of victims of violence and 80% of victims of intimate partner murder are women. Women are more likely to have more severe forms of violence. But over the lifetime of a person, there's still a lot of men who would experience violence at some point. As a woman, I can only speak as a woman and from my experiences, but I do know that there are social stigmas for men, especially to come forward about violence, which makes it more challenging sometimes for them. They're more likely to be dismissed.
When I hear the word violence, I tend to think of physical violence. Is that the only type of domestic violence there is?
There's a lot of other kinds, and I think it depends too on if you're thinking like a violent act or if you're thinking about general violence against a person, which or different types of abuse. So, abuse can range from physical to emotional to financial. I'll list the recognized ones in Canada, which would be physical abuse, harassment, stalking, sexual violence, emotional or psychological abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, reproductive coercion, coercive control, and then technologically facilitated abuse, which would be using different forms of media to target someone. So there's a lot of different kinds. Personally, and from what I understand from other people as well, most abusive situations tend to start on the emotional and psychological side of things, and then they will escalate. Abuse will go through what some people will call it a cycle, but it's more like a sine wave that's always increasing. So you'll get times where things are really good, and you'll get times when things are really bad, but it's not going around and around and around like they used to talk about it because it tends to always get worse. Every flare up is worse than the previous one. So often it will start more in kind of emotional stuff, but it usually ends with physical violence. And the longer it goes on, the more extreme that gets.
I know you can only really speak for Ontario, but what supports are in place for domestic violence?
There's shelters across Canada for women. As I said, I'm only speaking from my experience from surviving it myself. The women's shelters, unfortunately, are extremely they're not overcrowded so much as they're underfunded, so they can't let you in. So when I was there, it wasn't that the shelter was crowded, it was that they were turning people away and um, they didn't have the supports to really help me while I was there. I was basically completely isolated within the shelter. I was having to do a lot of chores to help maintain the building, which was really stressful to cook for. I think I was cooking for 15 people, which while going through shock, etc., for having totally torn up my life. There is a housing wait list you can get on. I think if you're in a shelter, it's about 5 to 10 months you have to wait in a shelter. If you're not in a shelter, it can be 5 to 10 years. There is welfare you can get on, but it doesn't provide enough money to actually live on. So you're going to have to find things like food banks, or I know in Ontario there's the St. Vincent de Paul Society, which will give you vouchers for clothing and food and stuff like that. So there are resources. You have to learn and reach out to a lot of different systems. It's not a convenient and streamlined thing where you go to a place and they give you all the help you need. You need to go to multiple different places and get resources from all these different things in order to get enough to get by. There is fortunately legal aid. So if you are in a position financially where you don't have money and you're just getting by, they will cover or assist with costs of a lawyer. The lawyers tend to be a lot busier because they have a lot of clients usually, but they will at least provide assistance for you, either covered by the government or in my case, it's one where the home I owned with my ex was put a lien on, and when the home sold, my lawyer was paid from the proceeds of the sale of the home. So I didn't have to pay anything up front.
This might be a dumb question, but can teenagers be target of domestic violence as well as adults?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's obviously parental violence, but there's also intimate partner violence. And anyone who is in any sort of intimate relationship can end up in a violent situation with someone who is incapable of having a healthy relationship. From what I understand, actually, young people are at higher risk as well as minorities. So, like Stats Canada is saying that um, young women 15 to 24, at least 30% of them have already experienced intimate partner violence in the last 12 months.
So, from what I understand, from what you're telling me, there isn't there is stuff put in place. It's not properly funded. Is that a correct statement?
That is a correct statement. There has been also funding cuts over the last few years. Um, eh, so it's been difficult. A lot of the shelters don't have the staffing they need to run the shelters well, nor to take in as many people as they have beds. So the shelter I was in, there was empty rooms, but they were understaffed and they couldn't actually use those rooms.
Is it true that domestic violence can cause long lasting effects such as PTSD?
Absolutely. So you think about like your home, which is normally your place where you would feel safe. And I'm just talking about my experience specifically. Obviously, some people don't live together and still experience violence. But in my case, my home, which was where I was supposed to be safe, wasn't a safe place. The person that I had married, that I was thinking that this is going to be my person, that if I'm ever distressed or frustrated or whatever, that they're a safe person to be with and express myself with, turned out they weren't safe and they were actually using my difficulties to manipulate me and get what they wanted. So it really makes it hard to feel safe anywhere if the place where you're supposed to be the most safe, you aren't. So I absolutely have PTSD. I had some experiences as a child with my parents and my elder brother that also caused PTSD, but certainly my experiences with my ex both made that PTSD worse and created new symptoms.
I'm sorry to hear all that. If the situation is toxic, why do people or violent, why do people go back?
I think it's one of those things where you have to remember that the violent incidents don't happen in isolation. There is a relationship there. So I'm sure you've had friends where you've had disagreements with or conflict with, but you've stayed friends. It's a lot of the same thing where, like with my ex partner, it started as simply as him forcing me to hold his hand and telling me that, oh, you're just scared. I'm being romantic and helping you overcome your fear. And I was young and naive and I believed that. And so when things start to escalate, it's generally a slow process and it's within an otherwise relatively okay marriage. When I left my ex, pretty much my entire support system claimed that I was the one at fault because they couldn't perceive that the relationship was abusive and felt like I had to be making it up. Because from the outside, things looked rosy. And those rosy experiences, I was there for them. So it's not like every single moment is toxic. And often there's financial things, or my ex and I had a child together. So I wanted to try to make things work if I could so that my child didn't have to go through having two homes, right? Like I really wanted to have that for him and I couldn't provide that safely. So I ended up having to leave. But I did try to live in the same house with my ex and have each our own space to see if we could kind of do a roommate situation, and hoped that that would make the violence go away. It didn't, it escalated, but um you kind of want to try because you've invested however many years. I was with my ex for 10 years. So after that long, it's like, do you really want to restart your whole life? It damages your friendships, it damages your social supports, it's financially taxing, it's emotionally draining. If you have children, there's challenges there as well. Not that it isn't worth it to leave, because that way you're modeling that it's not okay to abuse. If you have a child, like for me, one of the reasons why I felt like I had to leave was that I didn't want my son to grow up thinking that this was okay, that this was how women are to be treated. Um, so while it was hard, I think it's much more healthy for him as a child as well to have a home where he is safe with me and to have an experience of no, it's not okay to treat people this way.
So, as someone who's been through it, you must have advice for people that are going through it currently. What would that advice be?
I think the biggest thing is you aren't alone as you feel, not that your current social support system is safe. They might not be. I lost 99% of my support system, including my family, for a period of time when I left my ex. But there were things that caught me. There was a women's shelter. I got on Ontario Works. I found a place that was willing to rent to me. It's tiny, but it's home. I went from living in a 1,200 square foot house to a 300 square foot apartment. So it's a big adjustment, but I still have a place to live, and it's a place where we can thrive and start to grow again. As I said before, like, and it would be something I would shout out, is just the St. Vincent de Paul Society has a lot of good resources for people that are going through a difficult time. So there are a lot of things that are out there. There's a lot of support groups on social media, on Facebook, and different places where you can find other survivors, where they will share ideas and then walk you through things and answer questions you might have. There's some really good books that I found. The ones that I really liked the most was Is It Me by Natalie Hoffman. Um, that one's aimed more at a Christian audience, but I think it could generalize to everyone who's experiencing coercive control. There's also the autobiography, Did He Hit You? Where it talks again about coercive control, because usually, even if there is physical violence, there's also other sources of violence as well. So I think just taking baby steps and realizing that, at least in Canada, we do have social support systems in place. There's a lot of women's shelters. Typically, they might be full and you'll have to call around. Or you can ask them to call around for you, which is what I had. Is one of the staff at one of the shelters was willing to call all the other shelters in the area, and I ended up actually going about an hour outside of my community, but the shelter covered a taxi to come and get me. Um, so they do have things in place. Also, don't be afraid to call the cops. Yes, it can be messy, but if you don't have a police report, then it's going to be hard to get custody later. So I have 50-50 custody. And I think part of that is that I didn't call the cops when my ex was violent. It wasn't super violent, so I just dismissed it and downplayed it. But if I had have made a police report at the time, then that would have been much more helpful in terms of going before a court and actually getting a situation where I'm not having to co-parent with my abuser, which is difficult. So a little bit of a muddled answer, but basically there are resources. They're underfunded, but they are there and you can get into them. And it's okay to get that help. Like I felt like maybe I'm lying, maybe I don't really need to be here, maybe I'm making it up, but I could also sit there and reality check. And sometimes writing down the events can help, both as a log for if you do ever end up in court, but also just for you to go, wait, if he starts love bombing you or if he starts acting nice again, you can go back and look at these things that he's done as well and go, okay, well, those things I wasn't okay with. So even though he's behaving well now, I know that these other things also happened. And I know I'm speaking in a gendered way. I'm speaking from my experience. Intimate partner violence can happen from a partner of either gender towards a partner of any gender. So it's not just male to female. I'm just speaking kind of from my experience of a male to female violence.
I'm pretty sure I know what love bombing is, but just so I'm clear, could you explain what love bombing is?
So love bombing is typically when the partner who's being abused finally makes some sort of move towards leaving the relationship. It can also happen after an incident of intense violence if the abusing partner feels bad, because often they do. It's not that they don't feel bad necessarily. They're trying to get their needs met and their needs met. Boy, I switched up the letters there. And they're doing it in a way that's maladaptive and harmful. So typically, love bombing will happen either after an incident of violence or after the partner has made some effort to escape. That might be going to a shelter, that might be going to a friend, that might be moving out, whatever stage you end up being at. The other partner, the abusive partner, wants things to go back to the way they were. And typically, they think, oh, now I'm going to fix it. So it can be anything from them starting therapy and actually going to see a counselor and promising they'll do better, to buying flowers, expensive gifts, trying to take you out on dates, doing all the things that you've asked them to do in the past, all the different things that you've wanted them to do. It might be quitting alcohol, it might be spending more time with the kids, depending on where things are at. They're basically doing all the things you've always asked them to do, and sometimes even above and beyond that. So it's this really intense period of time where everything seems perfect. You're getting everything you ever dreamed of. But the problem is that this isn't a sustainable change that's being made. It's an effort to make things go back. And then if you go back to the way things were, it just restarts. It goes back to the abuse. So that's why it's called love bombing, is because they're just basically raining down good things upon you to try to fix things. I actually didn't get that much from my ex. Once things started to go bad, they just got worse. But it is a common thing that happens that people do experience. And I have had it from other exes that were not like that. Even just if I broke up with them for whatever reason, because it wasn't working for me, I've had some exes love bomb me where they were just like promising the world anything I could ever want if I would start dating them again. And you have to remember, no, I ended this for a reason. That reason hasn't changed. Now, if you want to try to reconcile with a partner, you have to think, okay, set your boundary, get to a safe place, stay there for 6 months to a year, and then only if they're seeing a therapist, like a licensed therapist that's actually trained in this and they're putting in work, and then you can start to look at considering reconciling. But even then, like, I wouldn't recommend it, but for people who are tempted to do it, I would say wait 6 months to a year, because love bombing won't generally last that long. And so then you'll get to see them go back into their patterns.
As everyone who watches my videos or I've interviewed is aware, I like to end my interviews by giving the people I'm interviewing a soapbox to stand on and shout out anything they recommend, anyone or anything they want to shout out at this time, and that is what I'm doing now.
And so I think I kind of already integrated it into my recommendations. There was Did He Hit You? I don't remember the author right now. Is It Me by Natalie Hoffman is also really good. Those both were helpful for me. If you want to know more about my story, my website is Ella Meadows at wordpress.com. I think Fajuk has linked it before as well. It's mostly a poetry blog, but I do share my experience as well with violence. And if you guys have any questions, you're welcome to ask them to me as well, either in the comments or on my Twitter or on my blog. So if people have questions or if they need resources, you're welcome to private message me on Twitter as well. I have my private messages opened if you need resources.
Take care of your mental health out there, people, and your physical health.